Shalom and good afternoon or evening, depending where you are, and welcome to Superheroes for the Messianic Lifestyle here on lamnetwork.tv, where we interview people who have been walking the life of Torah for a while now, to give you hope that you're not alone in your understanding that God still cares about his commandments, he still considers them the standard of a holy life, and wants us to live by them through the lens of the finished work of Yeshua the Messiah. My name is Darryl Weinberg of A Light to the Nations Messianic Ministries, and I am honored to be your host this evening. And tonight we have someone who is no stranger to either the Messianic Lifestyle or lamnetwork.tv, none other than Dr. Dinah. Welcome, Dinah.
Well, thank you, Darryl. Great to be on your show.
It's great to have you. You know, you and I, we chatted last week for the first time one-to-one. I mean, I've certainly been aware of your work, but this was really the first time you and I had a chance to chit-chat. And it was just like we were, old high school buddies or something like that, just kind of chewing the fat there. It was really neat to see that. And I think part of that is because of your origins. You lived in Ottawa for a while.
Fellow Canuck, I can always relate. And I was laughing because I can hear your accent quite clearly. Mine's gone. So I'm thinking by the end of the broadcast, I'll probably start incorporating your accent back in again. Yeah, so I was born in San Francisco, so I have dual citizenship, but I grew up in Ottawa, and all my family lives in Ottawa, so that's kind of my stomping grounds. I went to Carleton University, ice skated on the canal, did all that good stuff, went to camp there. And then probably in my early 20s is when I finally left Ottawa and actually left Canada. So I've been living in the United States for, 40 some years now.
Okay. And what was the reason for the transition?
I was bored. So I gotta go back to, it's the 60s, the early 70s. I am a hippie extraordinaire, so I'm very involved in all those hippie things, traveling about, concerts, all the sort of things that went with that. And honestly, I dropped out of university. I went to Carleton University, as I said. I dropped out because I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I was bored to death with living in Ottawa, since it's the capital of the country, and it's filled with members of parliament. It's a very conservative in a different way than we understand it now. And yes. I was not tracking with that. Although I have to say, after the trucker convoy, it restored all my faith in my fellow Canadians, and in particular, the people that live in Ottawa. I was very excited because I spent quite a bit of time around the Parliament buildings. When I was a young hippie, I worked down in the marketplace selling flowers and doing all kinds of things like that. So I was quite inspired by the trucker convoy. But, I just kind of threw a backpack on my back and headed off to Europe in my early 20s. The quintessential wandering Jew, trying to figure out who I was, where I belonged. So I lived out of a 14-pound backpack for about 5 years in search of the perfect beach, and in search of, I always spent a lot of time in bookstores and dabbling into the occult and things of that nature. So, it was a very long time ago, and I was a very confused young person, but I did finally meet my Yeshua.
So how did that happen, and where did that happen?
It's a relatively long story, and I encourage people usually to go onto my website, which is foundationsandtorah.com. And on the homepage, there's a section that says there's free material there, and I have my testimony. So if you actually want to hear the whole version, because it's quite long, you can go there. But I'll have to, give you a bit of a synopsis here. So just a heads up to the listeners. Growing up in Ottawa, I grew up in the Jewish community there, and my family had moved to the outskirts of town into the Goy community, the Gentile community. And so when I grew up, I was really the only Jew in my neighborhood and in my school. So I think back in those days, we had a foundation, a church foundation. A lot of my friends were, Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Methodists. And I think that there was sort of this competition to see who could convert me first. So the families would invite me over. And I remember at Christmas was kind of funny. We didn't celebrate Christmas. And so Christmas morning, I would go out to all my friends' house, from house to house, and their mothers had purchased gifts for me. So that would pile up, and then I would head home and wrap all this stuff. I thought Christmas was just great. Like, is this what you do? What did I know? I was just a kid. But I was exposed to, I had gone to church with a number of my friends, so I was exposed to something. I mean, wasn't able to put it together. I remember in public school too, we had a 20-minute period of, quote, religion. And the teacher would tell me, Dinah, you can leave the class. They knew I was Jewish, and somehow they weren't going to offend me. I mean, I'm only, 10, 12 years old. But I didn't want to get up in front of the whole class and walk out, singled out as being this person that wouldn't be there in religion class. I mean, imagine that for a young person. So I just would stay. So I that's when I heard the Lord's Prayer and maybe, pieces of the gospel. And I heard something about a man named Jesus. So seeds were planted. And then I kind of moved on. As I said, I traveled quite a bit. And I spent some time in Israel in 1973 into 74, right after the
Yom Kippur War.
Yeah.
Wow.
Crazy time. And of course, everything is, tanks strewn all over the place. And friends of mine lived up in the Golan Heights, which is where it all was. So I'm kind of the intrepid soul. I always find myself in crazy places. But that was a really, Israel at that time, it's hard for people to imagine because it was not that modern, cosmopolitan place that it is now. There was hardly any roads. And like I said, everything was blown up and burnt out. But somehow I ended up in the Sea of Galilee at the kibbutz Gan Aleph. I spent a number of months there. And that was kind of an interesting experience on the kibbutz. I was in the sort of volunteer camp. So I do remember the snakes a lot. That was, I didn't care for that. But met a young man from Holland there, who's actually from Utrecht, which kind of the center of what's going on too with the Dutch farmers and everything. But he started telling me about Jesus. Again, this was this opportunity. And I went to Jerusalem. Actually, we walked the Stations of the Cross, and I was puzzling over all of this. Who is this person? It was an interesting experience, and built a lot of friendships in Israel. Ended up, long story short, came back to Canada, and I have this issue with boredom. So, a friend and I ended up going down to Central America. After that, I didn't stay long, and I lived in Guatemala for, I don't know how many months it was, and in a little tiny town called Panajachel on Lake Atitlan, which a beautiful, beautiful place. And one night, in the middle of the night, I had a dream about an earthquake a week before, and we saw that the animals were acting crazy. And so in the middle of the night, one night, massive, massive earthquake in Guatemala. People may not remember. It's 1976. February 4th at 3:30. I remember it quite clearly. One of those moments in time, right? My bed flew across the floor. The front wall of the house went down. It was about an 8.3 earthquake, and probably upwards of 200,000 people died in it.
Wow.
The epicenter was south of us. We were on the lake, as I said. That night, there was a school bus that was parked down on the shore of the lake, and literally the lake picked it up, the bus, and moved it over, and everyone in the bus drowned. I mean, I can't even begin to express the tragedy of this and the people. And then you saw, the federales come in and take all the food. People were starving. We're living out in fields because you can't go into any building. There were so many boulders that had come down off the mountains, we couldn't get out of the country. So we were essentially trapped in Guatemala. And so my family had no idea, if I was alive or dead. So I kept signing papers, like Red Cross papers. And a guy had come through, and I signed this one paper, and it ended up going to the Canadian Embassy and then on to Ottawa. So somehow through this person was able to connect with my parents and then let them know that I was okay. So I ended up in San Francisco after that for a little while and became a communist for a period of time, marched for Che Guevara and all that sort of thing. Got tired of that, and a friend and I, we emigrated. That's kind of a joke. We went to New Mexico, because most people think New Mexico, well, at least a lot of the millennials today think New Mexico is another country. So we ended up in
I think a case could be made for that, no?
What's that?
I think a case could be made for that.
Yeah, I often say that. It's true. Well, they do call it the land of enchantment, so that can run in a number of different directions.
And listen, I lived in Los Angeles for a while, and that's a different universe altogether.
Yeah, you got that right. So, friend and I kind of put down roots in Taos, and we were very involved in the New Age, as I mentioned earlier. And so, at one point, I went down to, there's a town, you may not have heard of it, Alamogordo in New Mexico. It's where White Sands Missile Range is. And I went down there to, they called it the Quimby Center, to, quote, get my aura balanced. And, they go through this whole rigmarole. But what was funny was whoever was doing the reading, the past life reading, was telling me that in a former life, I was a disciple of Christ in Israel. So that kind of, got me going. I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. I went back to Taos, where I was living, and I proceeded to take out books out of the library about the life of Paul and Peter. And someone handed me a Bible. That was the first time, I think, that I ever read of course, I was very familiar, obviously, with the Old Testament and the Torah. I mean, I grew up in that environment. But that was the first time I'd ever read the New Testament. So you have to appreciate, this is a long journey of searching for self. We're pretty indulgent hippie types. And when I got to the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery, it was that was my moment. How you remember these things pretty clearly, in which I said, truly, this man, Yeshua, Jesus, is the Messiah. Of course, I didn't call him Messiah then, but I understood that he was, by his death and his burial and his resurrection, something transformative had happened, and that could happen in my own life. And indeed it did, because I know, looking back, 24 hours later, I'm not even the same person. Now, it's not like I don't have the struggles and stuff, but I knew I was a different human being, that the filter through how I was viewing the world had completely changed, and that God had transformed my heart, and I was no longer the same person. So round about the same time, a young man named Andrew Bush had come to Taos. Now, you have to appreciate, this is the 70s, the mid to late 70s, and there are a collection of hippies living in Taos in communes. And there's a bunch of us. And in fact, there is this little enclave of Jewish hippies in Taos who are all kind of coming to Yeshua at the same time. So some of them went on to start amazing ministries. I think of Andrew Shishkoff in Israel, the Tents of Mercy. He started that ministry there. So all of that started in northern New Mexico, because we were all kind of coming in at the same time. There was definitely some sort of mini revival that happened in that place at that time. And so Andrew he's actually supposed to go to archaeological school, I believe. No, it was architectural school, excuse me. And he ended up coming to Taos and starting a church. And so that's where I started out. It was an Assemblies of God. But he's an ex-hippie. And everyone at that time was interested in, quote, the Jewishness of the gospel. And so we did Passover Seders, and like I said, I'm not, quote unquote, educated in the New Testament, but as I'm reading it, I begin to see that it's so Jewish. So when you don't have any kind of filter or bias as you're approaching the scriptures, you can look at it very fresh and not insert all of your, preconceived whatever. So I could see the language, the Jewishness of Yeshua, and the language, the Hebrew language, and just the cultural things that were going on. And it sort of all began to connect for me. And so, the past, Andrew, this is kind of funny. I mean, he's just starting out at church, and like, I'm one of the first believers, first converted. He gets a converted Jew, right? I mean, what a milestone for him in this church.
Exactly.
And so what he's trying to fill all the positions, got all these ministerial positions. So he gives me the youth. I'm barely older than they are. And I'm now the youth leader teaching them. And I always say those kids don't know how good they had it, because the only thing I knew to teach them was the Torah and things in the Old Testament and the festivals and, sort of that the culture milieu of Jewish. And so all those young people were raised. I mean, they were with me for a number of years. And so, we were in the Assemblies of God Church. So I'll stop and take a breath, see if you have any questions. But that's kind of that's the quick version of my transformation.
Well, and I find that with Jewish people, it usually is quite the journey. And part of that is just because it is so difficult for Jewish people to make that transition. I mean, I remember when I first started to get the inklings, I grew up in a Reformed Jewish household, but my mother at the same time, she worked for a yeshiva for 20 years.
Really?
So, yeah. Ultra-Orthodox. And
there's a conundrum.
well, my mother never really even believed in God. She was an agnostic right to the day she died. And yet here she is. She's working for this ultra-Orthodox Hebrew school and telling me when she came home that this rabbi said this and this. So I grew up with both ends of the spectrum of Judaism. The Reform, we don't believe in anything, and the ultra-Orthodox, where we take every step, very seriously. And neither of them resonated with me. And yet, even though I had rejected Judaism that had been presented to me, and I was open to the gospel, it still took me 3 years before I was finally able to accept Yeshua as the Messiah, because both the church and the synagogue tell you if you believe in Jesus, you're not Jewish anymore.
Right.
And so, a lot of people, what they don't understand now, back in the hippie movement, when you got saved there, and there was a great revival. I mean, Moshe Rosen, what he started with Jews for Jesus. And even before that, starting with ABMJ, that became Chosen People Ministries.
Right.
There were Jews that were kind of falling off the tree, getting saved.
Yeah.
But
70, that was a moment in time.
Yeah. But by the time I came to faith in the late 90s, we had kind of calcified a little, and, going back to the difficulties that we had experienced. And, it wasn't until I could reconcile believing in Jesus and still retaining my Jewish identity that I was able to make that profession of faith, because I didn't want to give up being Jewish. I didn't know why it was important, but somehow God had put this thing within my heart that it was. And I think, obviously there's more awareness that's coming out now within certain, sectors of Christianity. But without understanding that, you're not going to get very far with the Jewish person if you're going to be presenting the gospel, unless you can prove, and I challenge churches all the time with this, unless you can prove that Yeshua is the Messiah, stopping at Malachi, you're not getting anywhere with the Jewish people by and large.
And it's unfortunate too. Like I said, this was a moment in time in the 70s. And all the Jewish people that I was surrounded by were all like me. They were seeking, they were hippies, and they weren't afraid to investigate the New Testament. Like we didn't have all of those challenges in that way. Right. And I can't really explain why. It's just, we were all kind of on the same page, and we just, together we could see, okay, there's a connection between these two things. And so it was easier to embrace. But you're right, now it's much more difficult. And most of the people, I'll run into a lot of Jews who don't have any connection to God, like what you're saying. So finding a starting place is really difficult.
Yeah.
Because most of us grew up, I was from a conservative background, and most of my Jewish friends at the time were also, some were Orthodox, some conservative. But I can't really think of anyone who was from Reform. So we did have, we understood there was a God. How well we knew him was another matter, but that was our starting place. So it was much easier than it is, I think, now. And
well,
so I
think in
back to me, just one sec. Because it's the transformation that was the key.
Yeah.
All the other stuff, is stuff. But when you know that you know that you know that you are not the same person, that God has done something in you, that's the thing I try to bring to Jews who are just resistant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think one of the other challenges that we now face is that the arguments against Christianity within the Jewish community are a lot more sophisticated now.
True.
Jews for Judaism are well trained, and they're a lot better funded than the Messianic ministry by and large too.
Yeah, that's true.
I remember back in 2001, I'd only been a believer for 3 years, and my uncle took me to see the rabbi from Jews for Judaism, and I was covered in a lot of prayer that day because I knew I was going into the lion's den. I mean, this guy had studied the Brit Chadashah, the New Covenant, way more than I had. I never read the Bible before I got saved.
Yeah.
It was, even though, I grew up believing in God, I was kind of the freak in my family, but I had never, I went to synagogue a couple times a year. I made sure I, did the prayers, whatever, but I had no background in scripture.
Right.
And going up against this rabbi whose job it is to make sure that people like me understand that I'm Meshuggah for believing in what I do.
Right.
And yet afterward, I made it through, Baruch Hashem. I held my own. And I turned to my uncle and I said, listen, you don't believe any of this is true anyway. Why do you care? You don't believe in God in any way. Why do you care which one I do believe in? And he says to me, because that's what we've always done.
Right. Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, it's good thing you're not a lemming then, huh?
Yeah, really. Yeah, it's such a threat. Well, it was the same in my family because so my uncle was Orthodox. He ended up being the president of the synagogue. Whenever I went home, back to Canada from the U.S., we always would get in the, it was always a big meal, and now the debates come out, right? It's around a meal, argue about stuff, but it inevitably ended up on the Holocaust. If God is real, how did he allow this to happen? I mean, we would go round and round and round. And it was just, and I just, I had to just steady myself because I knew every time I went home and went to dinner with everyone, here it comes, I'm going to have to deal with this. And, they just, and they had, they had valid arguments. What can I say? But to try to show them the nature of God and his mercy and his love and his justice. The only way I could see of showing it was through me. And so that I needed to be that way, that I needed to be ethically and morally, behaviorally, showing them who he is through me, because they'd already formulated all the argument. There was no way I was going to break through. So I don't think people appreciate how important the testimony is in their own lives.
Oh, yeah.
People have forgotten. And then it becomes this academic exercise, which, of course, Jews love to do. They love to win debates, and, they're pretty good at it, and they're all lawyers.
We have centuries and millennia of practice on that.
Correct. Thank you, Paul.
It's genetic.
Yeah. And we're really good at it, but, it's not the thing that reaches the human heart ever. Yeah. I mean, you can get so far with it, but every person has to come on their own, kind of on their own terms and where they are in their journey.
Amen. Okay. And so you settled into New Mexico, and you obviously got married and had children, I'm guessing. And so, where did things go from there? When did your ministry start?
So yeah, it wasn't so right out of the gate. I was in the church, as I mentioned, and I was in ministry from basically day one.
Yeah.
I had no clue, so I had a long way to go. Now you have to remember, I was in the Assemblies of God church, so I personally do not. Those years I see as very valuable. There were lots of things I didn't agree with, and I ended up, kind of being labeled a heretic, and had to move on. But that's another story. But still, being in the church, understanding the theology of the church, and of course the assemblies had their own doctrinal views on things. But I don't think I would appreciate the whole picture as much as I do now in how I minister to people had I not spent time in that world with Gentiles and how they think and how, you know what I mean, and how they practice and what the festivals and things that they celebrated, what it meant to them. And, all that is important. And it was important to me. So,
Right.
yeah, I met my husband in church. Well, our story is another long story, maybe on another broadcast. My husband had spent time in jail, so just to wet your whistle. Anyways, he came around, and he basically was saved, unquote, quote unquote, in the same church. And we got married and had kids there. So we continued, both of us, in ministry. He ended up, with bus ministry. He was a superintendent of the Sunday school. I did music ministry, and I was teaching, and so we were very involved. And this is going to be like the early 90s. In there, I was also kind of politically involved as well. So one of the things I had determined, I had home births. Like, people didn't do that in the late 80s, stuff like that. I've always done things that no one else did at the time, but later they would do. So I've kind of had that pioneer spirit. And then I determined there is no way I am sending my kids to school. If it's the last thing I do, I will do whatever I can to homeschool them. So this is, 88, 89, 90 in there. And New Mexico was getting ready to pass a law to prevent parents from homeschooling unless they had a baccalaureate degree. Well, I had dropped out, right? So I didn't have a degree. So I went back to school and got my degree. I was going to do whatever it took to be able to homeschool my children. And so I did that. And then I was involved in the whole homeschool world in New Mexico back in the early 90s, and involved politically. I had opportunities to testify at the legislature and was involved with New Mexico, the homeschool educators here, and connected to the greater HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense, and all that sort of thing. And so that was my mojo then. I just plugged in, we were doing the church thing. I got my kids and I'm raising them and homeschooling them and doing all that. But and my husband, my husband and I have a window cleaning business. So I'm homeschooling the kids in the morning, and in the afternoon I do all the business stuff, because I was basically the I did all the taxes and payroll and, all that kind of stuff. Kind of the accounting. And so in extra time, I was studying scriptures. So, I had a pretty busy day. So I began to create binders full of material of study. So, this is really, the study part's been 42 years that I've been doing this. And of course, I don't think anywhere near the same way I thought 40 years ago. And I try to encourage people that way. If you're thinking exactly the same way you were 40 years ago, there's something wrong here.
Oh my gosh.
You need to be growing and changing and challenging yourself and thinking outside the box and learning to think critically about the scriptures, etc. So that was kind of my mission, was to try to help people, expand their understanding. And so the pastor in the church gave me the opportunity to begin to teach the, quote, Jewish feasts from the Hebraic perspective, and start to introduce those things. And of course, everybody loved it. It was, how could you not? But then it was a challenge because the pastor was threatened by me because I knew more than he did about that stuff. Well, how could I not know more than he did? I grew up in it. And so he couldn't handle it anymore. And so my husband and I were essentially persona non grata. We had to leave the church, but we ended up in a Foursquare church. Friends of ours were pastors there. So I ended up being the director of the Bible Institute then for Foursquare, got the certification for that. So just kind of kept going and introducing all these things to whomever would listen. And then kind of fast forward into the 2000s, I ended up in a program with Trinity Southwest University here in New Mexico. Steve Collins is the school he had put together initially under the umbrella of the University of Liverpool. He is an archaeologist digging at Sodom and Gomorrah. And I ended up kind of doing a master's doctorate degree kind of at the same time. They kind of didn't know what to do with me, so I kind of helped them put together my program. So I ended up graduating there with a D-Min in Hebraic Studies and Christianity. And it was shortly after that, I was working with Dr. Ann Davis from Bible Interact as a ministry, online ministry. We decided to take what we were doing and go down to God's Learning Channel in Texas, right, in Odessa, and kind of give them the spiel and say, listen, we would be a great benefit to your network. So they gave us a TV slot, and she had just kind of put together a studio. And this is sort of in the early days of putting together your own studio. So, I mean, the quality wasn't exactly where we are now.
Right.
But we had a show, and we would go into her studio. We would record and then send the recordings, or we would go down to GLC and we would do, sessions and record. Well, the folks at GLC, I guess, had heard from quite a few viewers. And so they invited me onto their Starship program in the evening called Light of the Southwest. And so I went, I had never been on TV in my life. Like, I don't know squat about being on TV. So what I did was I studied it for like 2 weeks, where they sat, where they were looking, trying to figure out where's the monitor, how are they dressing, what do the colors look like, just so that when I went into the studio, it all looked familiar and I didn't freak out. So it ended up being a really good broadcast. And then they invited me to have my own show. And it's kind of like, you might say the rest is histoire, because doors just kept opening, because people were really, things were moving it had in the 90s, but now by the mid 2000s, people were really hungry to understand the connection between the two testaments, that there's no, they're one seamless story.
Right.
And I continued to grow and see things, my own walk and journey began to evolve more and more until, I don't know, am I going to say maybe about 10 years ago, I recognized the significance of temple theology in the scriptures. And I didn't see any of that. Typically where you start as a teacher to instruct is with the festivals. It's the easiest place to enter in, to teach people about how they operate, how they can see Yeshua, what's the prophetic in the festivals. And so that's where I started to, help people engage. But I didn't really stay there. I was like, I got my journey, so I got to kind of see, I've got to move ahead. There's teachers coming up behind me. They'll help you with that. But there's things I have got to investigate. So the whole temple journey started probably then.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. The festivals chapter is by far the longest one in my upcoming book.
Okay.
Because there's just so much, and I don't by any means do a deep dive into all of theology. I just wanted to kind of give an overview.
Right.
And still, the chapter ends up being about 60 pages long.
Yeah, there's no way around that.
No, I mean, if you're going to cover all of them and how we celebrate it and everything else, but it is a very good foundation. And for people who are just kind of coming along with the whole Messianic lifestyle thing, if it is new, the feast days are the great place to start because they're God's appointed times. And,
Yes.
we have appointed times and we want our loved ones to show up. And so this is really what God is saying, is show up. I want to share some things with you. I've got goodies for you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, God tells us not to come empty-handed, but that's because he never has us show up and he's empty-handed. I mean, he's always got something to pour into us. And there's just, I think the church is just being robbed. Yes. Because of its unwillingness to say that, what, maybe there is something to it. It's not as if there's, I don't want to look at it like, there's judgment coming because we're not doing this. I look at it as, what are you missing out on?
Yeah.
I mean, they're so rich in understanding who Yeshua is and the plan of salvation and everything else. And so it's a good place to start. And for your former pastor to get all bent out of shape because you knew more. I had a meeting with a guy who we used to fellowship with, and he's a university department chair. And he says every time he comes around me, he feels like he doesn't know much. And I kind of looked at him and I said, you see that library behind you? I said, I actually read those books. I said, I should know more than you in this. If it came to what your field of study is and what you teach at university that you have a PhD in, I would not expect to walk into your class knowing more than you.
Yeah.
And, the biggest problem, I think, within the body today is the small K kingdom building. It's all about my ministry. It's all about,
correct.
I don't have a ministry. It's God's ministry. I just happen to work in it.
Yeah, I think we don't really understand the kingdom at all. And unfortunately, we end up in religious and theological boxes, and the kingdom is not in a box. And, I've been at this for 42 years. And so, I have devoted my life to understanding the scriptures. I always tell people, listen, there's a lot in the Bible that makes no sense. I mean, let's just be real here. And if you think you're going to have it all figured out, approaching it from your modern mindset, it's not going to work. So it requires research and study and an appreciation of the ancient, primary sources, the ancient writings, and even, modern scholars. And unfortunately, people are terrified of scholars. So, when you read a scholarly work, full well, you're not going to agree with everything in there. Sometimes I find one thing in the entire book, but it's a jewel that helps me continually build on my foundation.
Absolutely.
And the goal to me is for people to understand the place of God's presence. If we're going to have appointed times and approach and meet, I think we want to be where he is. So I understand the temple, we see it now just as a physical structure, but in the ancient world, that was their thing. They had temples everywhere, on top of every mountain, everywhere. But the whole structure of Genesis 1 is a temple pattern of God building the universe, creating a tripartite structure, a three-chambered temple of heaven, earth, and sea. And that was going to be the place of his presence. And he was going to, in the center between heaven and sea, was going to install the place of his designated representative in his garden, earth, and, his king who would represent him on earth. And so, there's always, sorry. You might have to, oh my goodness, that was really loud.
That was.
That's right next door. Okay. So thank you, Lord. I guess he's meeting us on our episode here. But, you want to understand the place of his presence. Well, the ordered universe, the cosmos, is the place of his presence. And then he gives to his representatives, the ability and skill and wisdom to be able to build something where people could actually approach, so we have temple and tabernacle and things like that. But ultimately, this entire, if we can see, Genesis 1 is a temple pattern and his building until the seventh day. And in the ancient world, the seventh and the rest was always associated with the God, defeating all the enemies, and then it coming to rest in him installing his king to rule and reign over the kingdom, over the empire. And I just went back to the very beginning and started to try to understand it from the ancient perspective, knowing I don't want to live in the ancient world. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but we need to understand that first if we have any hope of trying to make an application for today. And it's just so rich, and it's common for the ancients, but we don't think like that. So my goal now is really to try to help people get into their world, understand it, and then make your application for today. And then you start understanding things in scripture that don't make sense. And there's just so many things that kind of have come together, and there's more clarity for me as I'm studying and then building on that.
Okay. Now, your website is Foundations in Torah. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes. So I think it was about 2012 is when I put together the website, foundationsintorah.com. And everything I've ever done is pretty well there. I mean, there must be, I don't know, 500 or 600 videos. So I worked with Bible Interact for a number of years. So I had a lot of recordings, some of my God's Learning Channel recordings. I've done work at the Hebraic Roots Network, Hebrew Nation Radio. Currently, I am on Israel TV Network. They're out of Amarillo. And it is a membership site. However, you can go from free to whatever if you want to support the ministry monthly. And there's just a ton of material on there. Like, you could spend a lifetime probably on there because it's my lifetime work, really. And then with that, I've written 3 books related to the temple. The first one's called The Temple Revealed in Creation. The Temple Revealed in the Garden is second. And then I just completed last fall The Temple Revealed in Noah's Ark. So the goal there was to show you the temple pattern from Genesis 1 to about 11, in the hopes that you would see this. If you've got these chapters, if you understand these chapters, you are going to understand the rest of the Bible. Now, not everything, I get that, but I have laid down for you the foundation of what, the place of God's presence, the temple structure, kingship, and then the elements that go with an ordered temple environment, things like wisdom and order and honor, and those things that were important in the ancient world. So the books are actually, you can purchase the books at Amazon. The PDFs are actually on the website. And for, if you're the gold member, you can have access to that there as well. But I think it's nice to have the book, actually, So people tell me they underline virtually every sentence. And so kind of this is self-defeating process, right? When every sentence in the book is underlined, you got to go back and look at it. So I am just passionate about that. But, I didn't stay, because you build the structure, but now you got to fill it. So now you got to put the king in on his throne, and then you got to bring the people in, the priests to serve, and all the different things that they do, and how they mediate between God and the folks. And so I'm just constantly understanding more and filling in more, and always trying to tie everything to Yeshua in the New Testament. Like, if I don't do that, and if I don't make a practical application for today, I don't feel that I've done my job.
Yeah. No, I feel very much the same way. It's nice to learn theology, but if I don't give you something that's going to impact your life today, then really have I done? I've tickled your intellect, perhaps. I've given you something to say, well, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
But other than that, I mean, as you said, the most important thing that we have is our testimony. It's our witness. It's our transformed life. My brother was an avowed atheist when I got saved, and he pretty much knows Yeshua is the Messiah now. Now, he hasn't gotten the whole lordship thing under control, but he said a lot of the transition that he made from being atheist, agnostic to, recognizing God and praying at times is because he watched the transformation that I went through.
Exactly.
And, and this is what tells you that that what we believe is real. This isn't some
Correct.
sort of theological check mark that we put in a box and we go on. It's not like, I'm a Scientologist or something like that, and so I adopt a couple of creeds, but then I'm still the same, reprobate that I was before. This is transformational. It's like God gets hold of your life, and He loves us too much to leave us the way that we are.
Amen, brother. This is and so I understand, we do operate in tribes. You're not going to be, it's not going to be one giant denomination. We're all in it. I get that. I mean, you work locally, you work in your tribal structure or whatever, and that's important. But it's also important to find a way to connect to other tribes and stop putting all these theological barriers in between. I mean, to find somebody that's actually going to think exactly the way you do is impossible.
God forbid.
You're married. How many things do we not agree on? But we know how to make it work. And so I get frustrated because I see sometimes in the quote movement that we're in that, people are so dug in with their theological position that they're not extending any kind of mercy and grace to others to where they are in their journey and allow them to grow, because they had a transformation too, and they know they're not the same person. So could we just kind of find some common ground? And this is just my opinion, but I believe the division in the country is based on the divisions that have come out of the faith community movement, church, Messianic, all that. The countries have been a reflection of just how we have been so not unified. And again, not uniformity, but that we can find common ground.
Well, university, it's unity and diversity at the same time. And are we not supposed to be salt and light? There's a reason why God says that judgment comes to his house first, because we're supposed to set the example, and whatever spiritually, we have the authority to bind and loose. And if we're loosing division and tribalism and, this denominationalism, then that's what society is going to look like. And so God has to come after us first to clean house there before he can turn around and go judge the rest of the unbelievers.
Yeah, so the church needs to get going on its house cleaning. I mean, that's the way you save a nation. And I think I see too many people are just kind of, oh, well, woe is me. God's in control. He'll just fix everything. That's not how it works. The kingdom.
He will, but I mean.
Well, but he needs his people to do their part. He's not going to wave a magic wand and make it all good. He expects his people to build the kingdom. And he expects his people he's given them gifts and talents and all those things to be able to grow the kingdom and to help those in, the less fortunate and the downtrodden, the vulnerable. Although, that's his heart. And we have a responsibility in that. And I feel once we really begin to exercise our responsibility in the kingdom, things will begin to shift and transform.
Well, with the understanding that from a Hebraic perspective, that it is, and Mark chapter 16 talks about this, that God worked with them in all of things, and the signs and wonders, the miracles, and even when it comes to finance, I have a course that I teach on biblical finance. Tithing is not going to get you rich.
Right.
God says in Deuteronomy 8:18 that he has given us the power to create wealth, not to receive it, but to go make it. Even Isaac, when he reaped 100-fold in time of famine, he still had to go out and sow.
Correct.
Probably people were looking at him like he was Meshuggah or something like that. It's like, what are you doing, guy? There's no rain. No, I'm going out. But God blessed it. And we've got this idea that, as you say, God's in. When I get together with pastors and they pray that, just puts my teeth on edge. God's in control. Yes, he is, and he's expecting you to get off your duff and go do something about it.
Yeah. Well, and I think you bring up really an important point. Probably the heartbeat of the Bible, of God, really, is it's creation, but not in a way that, yeah, God created the heavens and earth, is ongoing creation. And that creative order is to always increase and build and restore and prosper and benefit. And so you can see now we're in a period over the entire world of decreation, depopulation, deindustrialization, all the way down, in which we are creating scarcity and we are creating ugliness and on and on and on. And so the counter to that is to create and build, where things are growing, not decreasing and this is we are finding ourselves in a I mean, it is two kingdoms in collision in a way I don't know that we've seen. We went through the Dark Ages, and of course, then we had the Renaissance with the great art and literature and music and all that. So this is beauty, and then you come into the Industrial Age, and then you just see where, I mean, to the very essence of the Bible, the ancient world, was agriculture, right? To grow food to feed people so that your kingdom and your empire was healthy and growing. And so you see everything operating in this deconstructive, decreation environment. And so our job is to restore the new, the new creation, to build and to build up. So I think that's one of the most significant elements of the Bible. That's the key. Every story in the Bible, especially you see in Genesis, is retelling the story as a recreative story. It's telling the story of creation over and over and over and over again. And that's what we do in our lives. We show God, the hand of God's creation in our own lives.
Yeah. And, Paul talks about how in Ephesians 4:13 that unity is a sign of maturity. And when you consider that there are probably 3,000-4,000 distinct denominations, and then several and tens of thousands of expressions of those denominations.
Right.
He's called us a bunch of kindergarten kids. And the reason why we can't get culture to transform is because we haven't got they don't need more examples of division. They already have plenty of that. What they need is a difference. Telling people that you're going to have eternal life isn't going to get people saved. It's watching the transformed life here. And that's why I think the Messianic lifestyle, the halakha, how we walk, God changes people's walk. And that's what happened to you. That's what's happened to me. And, we're certainly works in progress. But unless there is a difference, unless I'm more like Yeshua today than I was yesterday, then really, what are we doing? And what benefit is there? What good is this? What good are we to God if we're not changing? God can't use us.
Yeah.
I don't think people understand that. It's just like God's just so excited that we're here. No, he's not.
And think of, especially now, think of the transformative nature of your life when you are out in the marketplace. And you are kind when everybody is mean, and you're courteous when everyone is rude, and you're patient when everybody's, ready to chop your head off. And just there's so many there's way more opportunities now in some sense to exercise the gifts of the Spirit and the Spirit, the Spirit itself, and how it's manifest than in any time that I can think of, certainly in my lifetime. Because people don't see it. All people are seeing is decay and destruction. So, if we come in as a rebuilt life and begin to pour that into others, I think we see people are suffering, and the hardships and the challenges. And we're seeing the drug abuse and the suicides. Like, where are we as a quote unquote, church? For lack of a better word, I don't have a word for it. Where are we? This is our moment.
Well, and I think a lot of opportunity was lost over the past couple of years. We saw a few people really step to the forefront, like the Mordechais, like the Daniels, But by and large, I think the body turtled. And it was I think, wasted opportunity. But what I love about the Bible is that it shows that God is always the God of second chances if we purpose our heart. So we got a couple minutes left. Any final words, anything you want to share with the folks about your ministry or what's coming? Or
Yeah, so going forward, I'm going to be doing, this session's already filled, but I'm probably 2 or 3 times a year now going to be teaching a class. Basically, it's called The Temple Revealed. But my hope is it's 12 weeks, and we're going through sort of the foundational things of the ancient world to help build your foundation and understand the scriptures and give you the big picture. So we're not going to get caught kind of, you can look at a book of the Bible and go through it verse by verse. That is not what we're doing. We're going to step back. We're going to see the big picture from Genesis to Revelation and try to understand that. So if you have an interest in a later class or whatever, please just email me. And my email address is really simple. It's just dinah@protonmail.com. Very simple. It's just protonmail.com, dinah@protonmail. So, reach out to me. And then again, all that material is on the website. If you want to begin to explore, there's plenty of information and teachings that are free. So if you want to just start there, that's fine. You can always get my books. All 3 books are on Amazon. You can just, put in Dinah Dye and they'll all come up for you. And I just want to encourage people because, we're headed into some really tough times. And this, if you don't have your anchor set and Yeshua, the Messiah, your boat, I don't know. This is a make or break time in your life. And I just want to encourage you to hang on to that anchor and you have a job to do, get with the Lord, talk to him, get your marching orders and find out what he's called you to do and do it with all your might. And he will equip you in every way that you need to do what he's called you to do. So
amen.
Kind of ended on that.
All right. Well, once again, the website is foundationsintorah.com and check it out. There's a ton of great material there. Dinah, thank you so much. It has been an absolute, we could go on probably for the next hour, a couple of definite like we are, but you know what? I know that God has got big plans for his people at the end. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining us once again for Superheroes for the Messianic Lifestyle. My name is Darryl Weinberg, and we will look forward to seeing you next Monday. Shalom and Laila Tov.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hugie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.